Good morning and welcome to another episode of Research Fantasy presents our NBA Fantasy Baller DFS edition for Saturday, April 15th, 2017. I'm your host, Nick Valinchak, better known as Nick from CWE on all of your favorite daily fantasy sites. I'm quite embarrassed at the moment because, as you can tell, we have moved from the back window to an office, and it definitely lets me know that I really do need a shave, and now all of you know that as well. It's playoff basketball time. Playoff basketball time is always a little more interesting than the regular season, though I think we can all admit that the wind down to the regular season was very eventful. It became very difficult to keep up with what was going on, and I know a lot of people end up getting I don't want to use the word screwed out of money. That's definitely not my intention here, but it definitely makes it a little more difficult to plan your lineups when you don't know how the rotation is going to work out. So a little bit different from what we've done in the previous podcast videos, whatever you want to call them, where we give you 3 core tournament plays, then move on to 3 value plays. Playoffs being a little bit different, much shorter slate with just 4 games most likely at the most on each slate. I'm going to just kind of go through each game here and give some thoughts as to what you can consider. So, first matchup starting in about 3.5 hours is Indiana and Cleveland. Cleveland has the home court advantage through potentially all of the playoffs, depending on what happens with the Boston Celtics. They're playing an Indiana Pacers team that fought very difficult at the end, fought very hard at the end in a difficult process to get into the playoffs. On the Pacers side of things, I mean, I think you're primarily looking at Paul George. As we use DraftKings pricing, 9,800, still not an amount that I'm going to sacrifice in playing Paul George. I don't know if you've watched the Cavs recently, but they are not sound defensively by any stretch of the imagination, and you do have the opportunity here for Paul George to come close to or exceed 50 fantasy points. In terms of other players on the Pacers that I'm looking at, I think the next guy I would be looking at is Miles Turner. He has a good price point, even though he struggled here and there, really down the stretch as this team was fighting for playoff positioning. He came alive. His price came up as a result of that, I understand, but I think when you have a guy that has 40-plus point upside priced in the mid-6s, you have to at least take a look. Thad Young, another guy who was turning on the engines down the stretch, I have no issues playing him. I'm a little bit torn on Jeff Teague. I don't know exactly how I want to attack that. And again, he's been solid, but not spectacular. I do think that the point guard position is a good way to attack Cleveland. And in terms of the bench activity, you can take a flyer with CJ Miles. At his price with DraftKings, dropping the cost of the min players down to 2K, I really do think there's a case to be made for Al Jefferson. I mean, you give Al Jefferson lower minutes throughout the year so that you can give him a little more of an expanded role in the playoffs when it's needed. On the Cleveland side of the ball, it's definitely the big 3. I mean, LeBron priced under 11K in a matchup where he's probably each time going to have to go out there and come to close to a triple-double for this Cavs team to win. It just seems like a silly position to pass up on, to be quite honest with you. So I think we have to be looking really heavily at LeBron James, Kyrie Irving. Kevin Love priced a little bit lower than maybe they should be. I think they've both got a floor of around 35, a ceiling of around 45. Worth a look in your tournament lineups. I love Tristan Thompson. Tristan's a guy I can definitely see getting up in the playoff series, 4,500. Don't really love Deron Williams at 4K, though I do think he can see some extended run. Ultimately, one of the more intriguing options to me is Eddie Tavares. It's going to be very interesting to see how he fits into the rotation, if he does at all. Hard to ignore what he was able to do in that last game of the regular season. Knowing that, how does the team approach a split of time at the center position? Do they want to go small? The Pacers are a team that does like to go big, so Miles Turner is in their plans down the stretch. Makes it a little more difficult to just blindly avoid the second center at a bare minimum price, especially on a night where my strategies are going to be centered around getting both George and LeBron James in my lineups. Moving on from there, Milwaukee visiting Toronto. Starting with Milwaukee, Giannis, excellent opportunity here to see what he's made of. I do have some concerns with his price, especially since he's priced higher than Paul George. Toronto, a little more stingy on the defensive end of things. I don't care what happened in previous meetings between these two teams because this is the playoffs. I like Giannis. I think of the three, he's probably going to be lowest owned in tournaments. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with risking that low ownership to gain an edge at other positions. I'm not really going to jump on the let's play Giannis over Paul George or LeBron because he's going to be lower owned when I think the risk is far greater and the reward might not be as great as well. Beyond that, on Milwaukee, I think you can give Chris Middleton a look. Greg Monroe's something that jumps out here. Again, I think this is the playoffs. You're going to see guys who normally don't see a ton of time get some more time. Monroe's one of those guys I think that they have to favor in this series over the likes of Thon Maker just because of the experience that he has. 4,800. This is a guy who by the end of this series could be at 6K if things go like I think they could. Beyond that, maybe Michael Beasley. I don't know if he ends up having a role on this team down the stretch. It's really tough to say. Tony Snell is prone to these big games here and there, so he's a guy in tournaments that I don't mind having a little bit of exposure to. Not my favorite game. I'm actually going to be probably lightest on this game of all the three. Moving on to the Toronto side of things, Lowry and DeRozan very much in play here. I do think both of them can exceed value at their price. Obviously, we'd prefer to have one without the other because we know where that production comes down to. I'm a little bit tepid on both Valanciunas and Serge Ibaka. Val, probably not going to be on my radar as I like some other players. I think where it really becomes interesting for me is looking at the trio of PJ Tucker, DeMarre Carroll, Norman Powell. Carroll and Tucker, more defensive grinder type players. Production, very, very, very inconsistent, both with very high ceilings at the same time. I'm focusing a lot of my attention on Norman Powell. I'm intrigued by how this team might be using him in these playoff situations. Price now under 3K. Don't think you're going to see a lot of these sub 3K guys with a lot of ownership. I could be wrong, but I think it is going to be a situation where players try to put in a guy like LeBron or George and try to get right at other positions. With Carroll and Tucker being so inconsistent on the offensive side, I understand they have both DeRozan and Lowry at full capacity, but it doesn't hurt to have someone like a Norman Powell who can come in off the bench, provide a spark in scoring. He's a guy I'm going to have some focus on tonight. Moving on to what looks to be the most boring game of the night. It's a game that I'm actually really interested in from a few different angles. Let's look at Memphis. I get that these are two slow-paced teams, but when I see Mike Conley and Marc Gasol priced 72 and 7K, I have a ton of interest. These are both 50-plus point guys. There's the potential for that to happen tonight because that's where the offense is going to filter through. Zach Randolph at 52 is interesting to me as well. Conley, especially with Tony Allen not likely to play anytime in the first round of the playoffs, usage goes up. Obviously, time is not what we are necessarily that concerned about, but it's just the amount of time that he's going to have to spend on the court in this matchup to try to offset the loss of Tony Allen. I think that this could be a situation. I do think like guys like Ennis and Harrison, this could be a game that's a little bit above their skill set, and they just kind of jump out as trap plays to me. San Antonio side of things, I think Kawhi has an attractive price. I don't hate him. Will have some exposure. Aldridge at this 6,200 number, again, this is a position where it's a little more intriguing to me because I see the upside. Power forwards against Memphis, the DVP on that reads off just because of the pace that Memphis plays at, allows for less possessions, therefore allows for less actual fantasy points to get scored, and that reduces the algorithm for ranking. So I don't mind LaMarcus Aldridge. I like him quite a bit. Pau Gasol has some interest in me as well. For me, a lot of this is going to be Tony Parker, man. I'm really, really, really interested to see how things work with this San Antonio team and Tony Parker in the finals. He's been maddeningly inconsistent, doesn't see a ton of minutes. Are you imagining a situation in a first round game that's going to be tough, a first round series that is going to be tough on the Spurs, after really not giving Tony Parker too much run all year for Greg Popovich to just decide that's fine to do in a playoff situation and determine that it's better to run with DeJounte Murray or Patty Mills? I don't see it happening. I'm not sitting here and calling Tony Parker a 40-point or a 10x value play, but I do think that we could see Tony Parker creep up into those 25 to 30-point production nights because the team is going to need him. That's it. Facilitating is going to be what he does here. Not horribly. I know that the position ranking screams stay away because Memphis is the first team in terms of defending the position. That if you're playing your fantasy games based off of DVP, you've already lost. So I am not going to really take much more time other than to tell you don't just focus on things like what it says the position ranking is against a specific team. I like Tony Parker tonight. Last up, let's take a look at what could be a really fun and exciting series to watch, and that's Utah and the Clippers. Both of these teams have quality bigs. Can't really say that about many other teams in the league. That's usually an area where things lack. I really love on the Utah side of things. I think you're fine with looking at the usual suspects. Rudy Gobert, price comes down a little bit. This is a guy we've seen with 50-plus point upside numerous times this year. Gordon Hayward, have to say I don't love him at this price with a full slate of players, assuming he sees a lot of Luke Ricard and Ba Mute, who is not a bad defender, is actually a pretty strong defender on wing players. I'm not saying that Hayward's a guy I want to completely write off, but I do find his ceiling to be a little bit lower than the price he's listed at tonight. Also, George Hill, I do like this matchup for him. He's been a guy who's been pretty good for me all year, seems to come through in these big games. Fits this Utah team just so well. If this Utah team can get maybe one or two players to come off the bench that are a little bit better than what they have now, this team screams contender. I already think they're a contender, but I'm talking a serious contender next season. Moving down from there, I'm good on guys like Ingles and Hood. I do like Derek Favors. I know that he's really been a pain for us this year, a thorn in our side, but I expect him to have to be on the court quite a bit to deal with a Blake Griffin, and just due to the fact that he'll be on the court quite a bit, I think his fantasy potential rises from there. That is about the extent that I'm going to look at guys on Utah for tonight. Looking at the Clippers side of the situation, really tough to not like all three of the big names from the Clippers: Chris Paul, 8,100, Blake Griffin, 77, DeAndre Jordan, 68. Again, it's a situation here where we're talking about the fact that Utah is a tough team defensively, but there will be points scored. I would probably play them in terms of their price point, with the exception being Blake Griffin. I think I would probably play Paul over Griffin. Something to me just seems off a little bit about Blake. Maybe things get corrected in the playoffs a little bit more. I do not mind Luke Amute price at where he's at. This is a guy I see having some 20-point upside in a game like this due to the defense that he plays, and Utah being kind of like a gritty, grindy type team. If he's on the floor for 25-30 minutes, there's certainly the potential that he's able to come through with 20 points. And now that his price has dipped below that 3K mark, I think he makes a really strong value play that is still probably going to go overlooked because there's just not a big offensive element to his game. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed the new format for the playoffs. I just think it's much more reasonable to do this than to try to sort out top threes. It's just a different animal altogether. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Head over to researchfantasy.com. Sign up for our NBA mailing list. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at Research and Win. And join us again tomorrow.